Do you know what we're doing today, everybody? Do you know what we're doing today, Nicola? Do you know what this is all about?
I think it's got something to do with a fish.
Well, it's funny you should say that. This is all about a story. You see, the most recent lesson plan in the LessonStream membership is called The Story of the Maverick Fish. But I want to just ask you a couple of things before we get to the story, Nicola. Are you, because Nicola's not actually based in Barcelona as I am, but you spend quite a lot of time in Barcelona, don't you?
Yeah, I come in most weeks.
So I'm wondering if you've noticed around the city all of these little tiny paper fish stuck onto windows, stuck onto doors, stuck onto the side of buildings, lampposts, even dogs. No, that's a lie. I've never seen them stuck on dogs. But do you know what I'm talking about here? Have you seen them?
No, I haven't seen them.
Because once you spot them, you can't stop spotting them. Once they've been seen, they cannot be unseen. And this here is an example. This is a door that's just around the corner from where I live. And if you look closer, you'll see that there's all these little paper fish. And the artist, whose name is Peces Polla, which in Spanish is a little bit rude, isn't it? Peces
Yes.
Polla is a mystery street artist. Nobody knows their true identity. But this individual must spend hours, hours at nighttime, I'm going to assume, when the streets are quieter, sticking on these little paper fish. Look at this one. This is another one just round the corner from where we are. I love these so much. I've put a few pictures on the LessonStream Instagram account. Here's me with a nice fishy background. Here they get everywhere. They really do. I said dogs. They don't really get onto the sides of dogs. But look, here's an old. Do you know what that is? Does anyone here not know what that actually is?
They're too young. I have a question.
Yeah.
Are all the fish different?
I assume they actually have to be different. And look at this one. Sometimes they appear as individuals.
Nice.
So let me just show you a quick close up of this. I really like this. I really like this picture. This is just to give you an idea. And I'm going to give you a quick task here, everybody who's watching. If this was a work of art in a gallery, which it's not, but if it was, and you were the street artist, Peces Polla, who created it, or maybe you're a curator, and if you had to give it a title, what title would you give this piece of art? Type your answer into the chat. What title would you give this piece of art? What would you give this piece of art as a title, Nicola? What would your choice be? Would you have anything up your sleeve?
I'm not very good at thinking of titles on the spot. I think maybe something to do with City Aquarium or City Fish or...
Well, for somebody who's not very good at thinking of titles up on the spot, I would say that's pretty awesome. City Aquarium. How about if we do this collaboratively and I take your City Aquarium and come back at you with Street Aquarium?
That's better, yeah. I think Peggy has a much better suggestion.
Peggy, that's an interesting one. Swimming upstream. Urban fish, says Lisa. Nice. Chaos, says Mary. So that was just a little introduction. That really has not got much to do with the story at all, does it, really, Nicola?
No.
The story, as we know, is called The Story of the Maverick Fish. So I think what we've got to do then is we've got to tell you the story. And I'm going to suggest that Nicola reads the story out. How do you feel about that, Nicola?
That's okay. Yeah.
It's a very short story. I think if we were to describe it, give it a genre, we could call it flash fiction. Flash fiction is a very short story, maybe just a few hundred words. Do you feel ready to read this story out to us, Nicola?
I've had my sip of water.
Okay, you've had your sip of water. Let us then, in that case, listen to Nicola reading the story of the Maverick Fish.
Once upon a time, a visitor visited an aquarium. She saw sharks, rays, clownfish, surgeonfish, a sunfish, an octopus, snails, hermit crabs, and even penguins. But the thing that got the visitor's attention was a shoal of little fish swimming around and around in their tank. There must have been 1,000 of them, and they were all swimming in the same direction. For a few minutes, the visitor stood in front of the tank and contemplated the shoal. She marveled at how incredible it was that these tiny individuals should come together and behave like a much larger creature with a mind of its own. But just as the visitor's own mind was racing with Buddhist-like thoughts, she noticed something interesting. A single solitary fish swimming in the opposite direction. Whereas the rest of the shoal was swimming clockwise, this little maverick was going anti-clockwise. The visitor was both fascinated and confused. She wondered what could possibly motivate the fish to behave in such a peculiar way. Overcome with curiosity, she decided to look for an answer, and she turned to the only aquarium employee in the area, a security guard. The security guard seemed to know what the woman was going to ask even before she asked it. He smiled and nodded all the way through her question. "It's fascinating, isn't it?" said the security guard. "And do you know what makes it even more incredible? It's always the same fish. If you look closely, you'll see a tiny mark just above its eye. But why does it swim in the opposite direction to the rest of the shoal?" Well, I have often wondered that myself. I have even asked the marine biologists who work here if they can explain. They are humble enough to admit that they don't know the answer. But do you know something else? I have had many conversations with other visitors about that fish. In fact, if I had to guess, I would say that for every 1,000 people who stand in front of that tank, the one person will notice the fish and ask me about it. Sorry, one person will notice the fish and ask me about it. The end.
Well read. I wonder if I wonder if everybody got it, because in the classroom, in the lesson plan, students are given the text to read in their own time, and I found that it's not always immediately obvious what the story is about. There's a few comprehension questions included in the lesson plan. Where does the story take place? Well, it takes place in an aquarium. How many people are involved in this story? What is unusual about the maverick fish? This word maverick being a person that demonstrates behavior which is different to the norm, or thoughts that are different to the norm. What's unusual about the maverick fish? And the idea is quite simply, it swims in the opposite direction to the rest of the show. They all swim one way, it swims the other. And there's a bit of a trick question here. Why does the maverick fish behave in this way? It's a bit unfortunate, I think, that they never get to find out the answer to why the fish is swimming in this way. But the story creates this parallel, doesn't it, between the behavior of the fish in the tank and the behavior of the visitors that pass through the aquarium. Let me just explain. This is a story that you never heard this until recently, did you, Nicola?
No, it was new to me.
Because I remember it from my school days. I remember it from years ago. I don't know where it came from. I don't remember who told it to me. I don't remember the title. I don't remember who wrote it. I don't remember anything about the story. All I remember is the story itself. And I used to love this story. It's obviously, and I don't know why this is, it's obviously it obviously affected me. It impacted me in some way or another. So the text that Nicola's just read to you was my attempt to rewrite the story as I remember it. And what do you think of the text, Nicola? If we were going to break this down, what do you think of the text as, let's say, a source of language. Do you like it at all as a language teacher? Because it is what we refer to as a piece of authentic material, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I think it's got lots of opportunities for different focuses or foci, hasn't it? You've got the kind of story markers like once upon a time, but the thing that got, or for a few minutes, but just as, so you could kind of use it for helping students write their own stories. And there's lots of nice adjectives as well: fascinated and confused, and the fascinating and fascinated. So there's lots of things you could use, or you could draw the learner's attention to.
Yeah, definitely. In the lesson plan, by the way, there's 2 whole pages which support students in their language comprehension, their familiarity with the specific words, phrases, and features of the text, so that we can get them to what we could call zero uncertainty, which is a term that I quite like. Have you come across that term before, Nicola?
No.
It was a term that came to me through Scott Thornbury's website. It's not his term, but the idea is that once you're working with a text, a short text like this, is a natural tendency for anybody, to want to arrive at some stage where they have no more questions about the language of the text. And when they reach that stage, it's what we can refer to as zero uncertainty. And as a term, I really, really like it. And so I'm always thinking of that. I think it's for short text, I really want students to reach zero uncertainty. I'm not happy just saying, there's some words you don't have to worry about. I think it's too natural an instinct for students to want to know every word in a short text. So I try to cater towards that. But it's funny because mentioning Scott Thornbury, I wonder if there's anybody here who was a LessonStream member as far back ago as maybe 2 years. Because I took this text, I don't know if I ever told you this, Nicola, I took this text to Scott's house, because Scott lives in Barcelona, and I made a podcast. It's a 2-part podcast in which Scott completely just goes to work on this text and looks at what he sometimes refers to as the hidden grammar. Any text can have something to offer if we can get down to what the text is about. And he had a really good idea for a task, which is what I've included in the lesson plan. And Scott, after working with it for a bit, said, well, this is about mental processes. It's about what goes on in a woman's mind in response to something that she sees. It's about wonder. It's about amazement. It's about attention. It's about cognitive processes. And we went through this text, and he was able to kind of identify about 16 different words and phrases that relate specifically to mental processes. And so we've got things like get the visitor's attention, contemplated, to marvel at, incredible, her mind was racing. And this is what the task is. The first task, I should say, is for students to try to identify all these by underlining them once they've reached, or maybe before they've reached zero uncertainty, but it's part of the process in getting them. Nicola, do you consider yourself to be a maverick fish?
Yes. I think I'm a maverick fish because I like to question things, and maybe it gets a bit annoying, but I always enjoy taking the contrarian point of view, and even if it's not my own, I think it's valuable to always swim against the tide a little bit, or go against the general consensus to try and point out to give a different perspective. But I think there's value in it, especially in these days.
Let me show you a few of the questions that I like to use in combination with this. Just before we get there, I should have mentioned this. I particularly like this part of the language focus in the worksheet, when students are invited to name these 9 animals, which you mentioned, Nicola, in the first paragraph of the story. But these are some of the, moving on to the actual story itself and the issues that come out of it. These are some of the questions. And it's a very, very natural question, I think, to ask. It's maybe the most fundamental question to come out of this. And I would guess that when you read this story or you hear this story, it's a kind of reflective question. Can I identify with this fish? Can I identify with this visitor to the museum? Sorry, to the aquarium? Can you think of a time when you swam in the opposite direction to the rest of the shoal, which is kind of an invitation to share a story, perhaps? And now I've been using this story for years, literally with students. I've used it in workshops. I've used it in my courses. And in my experience, I can tell you that this image of a maverick fish that swims in the opposite direction to the rest of the shoal is overwhelmingly seen as being a positive one. And I think that some of what you said there, Nicola, would kind of reinforce that. Would you agree?
Yes, I think everyone likes to see themselves as being the one who questions things, and that's probably a good thing, right? As Peggy says, it takes courage to swim against the tide of popular opinion.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, can we think of any famous maverick fish from contemporary culture or from history? And feel free now to type your answers in. And students can do this. They, even as a homework, they can find an example of a famous maverick fish, or maybe not so famous, somebody they know in their lives, perhaps. And then, very importantly, what did they do in order to swim in the opposite direction to the rest? There's some obvious ones like Steve Jobs, aren't there? He's an obvious maverick fish, although he's no longer with us. Rosa Parks, says Peggy. And you've got to go into the history there. What was the shoal, the direction? She was one of a few maverick fish, wasn't she? Nellie's got a great example here. Every example that you can cite is a potential story. One of the things I'm very interested in is how to get stories from a story, using a text like this as a kind of a springboard for students to think of or find or source and then tell stories of their own. I think this is a very important question. When might it be important to swim in the opposite direction to the rest of the shoal? And I think that the suggestion from Nellie is a great example, illustrates an important situation. But maybe because, let's just put it into the kind of the way the story is working, the shoal right now, we being the shoal, we're all swimming in one direction, and the direction is that it's generally good to be a maverick fish. You see what I mean? If we were to be a double maverick fish and go against the shoal, and you were to argue that in fact it can be bad, then give us an example of why it might be bad to be a maverick fish, and maybe back it up with an example. I think this is a very important question. Have you got any ideas of that, Nicola?
Well, it could be dangerous.
Because you could hit your head off the other fish that are coming towards you.
Yeah. Well, if you're going against something important, like the example here of kind of the Russian policy in Ukraine, and the example of that presenter, right? She you can get arrested. It can be dangerous.
What about for that? That's dangerous in the level of the individual, isn't it? How about at the level, the societal level of society?
I think David's just posted something that might be related to that.
Hello, David. That's nice to see you here. So that's a really interesting example. Do you want to comment on that, Nicola?
Well, I suppose that people who are refusing to be vaccinated, it's a bit of a can of worms.
A can of fish.
It's a lot more complex than maybe we can go into here, but I suppose it can be seen as dangerous if you don't take medical advice.
And also, what's interesting is that there is a big movement of anti-vaxxers, not just for COVID vaccinations, but all sorts of vaccinations. And this, as a movement, if we can call it a movement, maybe it's not precise to call it a movement, maybe it's a sort of way of thinking, it has been traced back to an individual who was, let's say, a Maverick Fish, Andrew Wakefield. He's a British anti-vaccine activist, former physician, and discredited academic who was struck off the medical register for his involvement in a Lancet autism fraud. This man is often regarded as the individual who is responsible for this movement or this common popular idea that vaccines cause autism. Do you know who this man is? This is most certainly a Maverick Fish. He's been in and out of the news a lot recently. He's famous for his website, which is called InfoWars. Do you know who this is, Nicola?
No, I've heard of the site, but I can't remember his name.
This is a man called Alex Jones. Now, Alex Jones is he's a very problematic person. He claimed that the 2012 Sandy Hook shootings, a terrible tragedy took place in the USA. The Sandy Hook shootings, Alex Jones claimed it was all a hoax. He claimed that it didn't actually happen, and he gave all this sort of conspiratorial reasons, none of which, of course, could be proven, but just reasons that had been pulled out of thin air. Since that, he's actually been taken to court. He's been forced to pay damages to the victims, the families of the victims of the Sandy Hook shooting. But very interestingly, I was listening the other day to a Guardian Politics USA podcast. I don't know if you know that one, Nicola. It's quite a new one. And there's do you know John Ronson? John Ronson.
Yes, I love John Ronson.
He's great, isn't he? John Ronson is an investigative journalist. And he became friends with Alex Jones years and years ago, even before Alex Jones was famous. And John Ronson is an authority in this guy. And in this, I've put the link, it's already there actually, the link to this podcast is underneath the YouTube window. He said that a court expert diagnosed Alex Jones as having narcissistic personality disorder. And narcissists, according to John Ronson, want to be the smartest people in the room. This is one of the things that defines them. And sometimes the way to be the smartest person in the room is to come up with some counterintuitive information that nobody else has, and often that's a conspiracy theory. And this man, John Ronson, who has explored conspiracy theorists for years and years, says that narcissists often dominate leadership of conspiracy theory movements, which is very interesting. There's another really good podcast from The Guardian in Focus, which goes back and explores the source of a recent, more relevant conspiracy theory about Ukraine. The title is How a Conspiracy Theory About Ukrainian, inverted commas, Bioweapons Labs Took Off. And it really goes into detail about how conspiracy theories is actually, it's become an industry. If you can come up with an original conspiracy theory, and if you can propagate it and it can take off, you can actually dine out on that. You can become a name. You can make money from it. And there's a lot of incentive for people to become Maverick Fish. And what I'm saying here, I think, is that in a world of misinformation and conspiracy theories, we've always got to ask questions of those who swim in the opposite direction of the rest. Nicola's a fish in the fishbowl. The fishbowl is the community platform where some of us, the members, LessonStream members, we share, we discuss, we network, we make friends. And we've got some of us, some fish are present here. Nelly, for example, David, Nicola, and I have to scroll back up. But Nicola's a recent member to the LessonStream membership, a recent fish, and we've been talking about some of these issues. And Nicola's been posting a few things. And recently, Nicola, you posted a question. Could you tell us about the comment that you posted in the fishbowl recently in response to this activity?
Yes, I was suggesting that we can take a different or an additional approach to planning lessons when we have an artifact like an authentic text, or with any lesson really, where we can focus on feedback. So I came up with this acronym a few years ago called FFP. I don't know if everyone can guess what it stands for while we talk about it. But the idea is that you try and anticipate what your students might say during a lesson. You might anticipate what problems they'll have, and you might anticipate what language you could give to support them in order to help them express themselves more effectively. It's that kind of I+1. So always thinking like, could I feed in something as well as feeding back on their language? Could I feed in something just to help them express themselves? And it was interesting listening to our conversation, because we were saying lots of phrases. We were using lots of phrases when we were asking and answering the questions that are above what a B1 or B2 student, where this kind of lesson is recommended for those levels. It's kind of above what they would be able to use. Things like to go against the crowd, to swim against the tide. And these are lovely phrases, right? And actually, I wrote down if I was going to answer those questions, I might want to try and use phrases like that, like I was a maverick fish. And in response to question 2, can you think of an example of when you were a maverick? I was a maverick when I went against, or I was a maverick when I disagreed with. Those are chunks that we can feed in. But sometimes it's really hard to come up with those on the spot. When you start listening to your students, you think, they're struggling with this. They could probably do with some little useful phrases. But if we think about the potential problems they'll have with their output, and how we can feed back and feed in, we go into the lesson really well armed and well prepared to support them. So another thing is to think about the errors that they might make. So like things like pronunciation of, my Spanish learners might say fish, or Maverick. They wouldn't. Maverick. We might just use 2 syllables and say Maverick. They would separate it into 3 syllables. So anticipating all of those things helps us think about how we can correct as well, because error correction is really hard to do well on the spot. But if you anticipate the mistakes before the lesson, you can sort of think through how you'll correct them, how you might use the board, what kind of drill you might give. So you might drill fish. You might think, okay, they're going to use a long vowel, so maybe I can come up with like a minimal pair, like fit and feet, to show them the mouth position. So you're thinking through, and you go into the lesson much better prepared to give feedback. And I think that kind of addresses the balance in planning. It's a nice way to kind of balance your planning, so you're not just concerned with the input and explaining, clarifying, checking, designing, tasks to help them reach that level of zero, what you called it, Jamie, zero?
Zero uncertainty.
Yes. You're also thinking about how to help them express themselves better for the kind of intended communication that's going to happen in the lesson. Well, there's quite an interesting approach that's like, I can't remember who came up with the acronym years ago, TAVI and TALO. I think I learned it on my certificate course, and it's a way of thinking and planning how you're going to use a text. And you can use it as a vehicle for information, which means like a springboard to talk about, or you can use it as a linguistic object. And usually it kind of does both things, so maybe you can plan your questions around those two things and think about things like CCQs based on what you're using it for and when. So if you're using it to focus on the language, then you would ask questions about that maybe before you get them to speak about it. And sometimes there's a real mismatch between the language in a text and then what students say about the text. There's this kind of idea that you can take language from a text and get students to use that language. And that's sometimes really hard because written English is totally different to spoken English. And that's a big mistake that I see sometimes with when I'm doing teacher training, is they assume that they can easily create a speaking activity based on the language in a text rather than thinking of it as a springboard, as a vehicle for information. So one thing is the receptive understanding of the language in the text and checking that and helping students understand it. Another thing is helping students talk about the text, but not assuming they're going to use the language from the text in their conversations.
It's a really good point. And this is something we've looked at in quite a lot of detail in the LessonStream story course about register, because it's such an important and often overlooked aspect of language, isn't it? And I think that's a really good example. Just one last thing, and this if you use the lesson plan, this is a way you control your students. Not control your students, troll them, wind them up, tease them, tell them that they have all failed the Maverick Fish test. Do you know what I'm talking about, Nicola?
No.
Back to this. Because you can encourage students to spend a lot of time looking at this and thinking about it and coming up with a title. And rarely, if ever, in fact, nobody does ever spot that there was a Maverick Fish.
I just saw it when you pointed, just before you pointed the arrow. I passed.
And I'm being silly, of course, because this is not the definition of a Maverick Fish, but it is in the story, isn't it? Because in the story, that visitor to the aquarium was 1 in 1,000 that spotted the Maverick Fish. So you can tell your students they've all failed. So everybody's thinking, yes, I'm a Maverick Fish. You can say, no, you're not. And let them go home with their tails between their legs. Not that fish have tails, do they? Do they? Some of them do.
They don't have legs.
They don't. What a silly thing to say. Of course they have tails but no legs. I'd like to say a big thank you to Nicola. And thank you to you all for being here. And of course, there's always the LessonStream membership. For anyone who'd like to join it, just go to lessonstream.com. And you get access to the community we mentioned. This is the platform online, the Fishbowl that Nicola and I are both part of. You'll see us regularly. You get access to the LessonStream story course. You get access to the LessonStream lesson plan libraries. There are there's 98 lesson plans currently there. You get instant access to all of them. The story of the Maverick Fish being the most recent one. And you get the Fishbowl Weekly, which is your weekly newsletter. And this is all for €8.99 per month or $89.90 a year. And if you're thinking about joining, my advice would always be just join, because if it's not for you, if you feel it's not right for you for whatever reason, just let me know. I'll give you your money back. That is the money back guarantee. All right. So if you're not with us already, do join us. You will not regret it. Am I right, LessonStream members who are here right now? Thank you so much to all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye.